On today's show, we discuss a 60-year-old problem between Arabs and Israelis. Should the Palestinians who fled or were forced from their homes in 1948 be allowed to return? Hello and welcome from Jaffa in Israel as we continue our special coverage from the Middle East, looking at 60 years of division between Israelis and Palestinians. Well, Palestinian refugees form one of the biggest groups of displaced people in the world. Over 4 million of them scattered among a number of countries, many of them in neighboring Arab nations. Their plight stems from the 700,000 or so Palestinians who left or were forced to leave their homes when the State of Israel was created in 1948. For 6 decades, Palestinian refugees have been calling for their right of return, facing strong opposition from Israel, which fears such an influx would undermine the state's Jewish existence. But in reality, how many would return? And considering all that's happened, where would they live? Many of their original homes and villages no longer exist. In today's show, we ask the question, what should be done about the Palestinian refugees' right of return? Don't forget, we take your calls on this show, and you can reach us at the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Joining me for our discussion is Professor Arnon Soffer, head of the Heikin Chair of Geostrategy at the University of Haifa, and a very influential analyst and advisor to the government of Israel. Also with us is Dr. Johnny Mansour, a Palestinian-Israeli writer and historian who lives and works as a community activist in Israel, also based in Haifa. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Professor Soffer, if I could start with you and note that, interestingly, you don't deny the Nakba, or the catastrophe as the Arabs refer to it. And I wonder, doesn't that place some sort of moral burden on you to look for some kind of reparation for what happened in 1948?
You mentioned 60 years of animosity. It started in 1921. You are talking about the largest, or one of the largest group in the world. Just to recall that between India and Pakistan, it was 6 million and 6 million. Just recently from Bangladesh, about nobody even know, maybe another 5 million. All over the world, we have faced this kind of tragedies. Just to recall Second World War, 20 million refugees, all of them were settled. And maybe we can start from the end, and then we will go back. I think that the income of the Gulf countries is about $500 billion this year. Take just $50 billion and solve the problem in the next 25 hours.
In what way?
This is not a problem.
Professor, in what way? How would you apply that money?
You have to tell the Palestinians, stop torture these miserable people in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, and maybe in Gaza, and give them money that everyone tomorrow will be a new millionaire, and solve the issue. And don't play with them 60 years in this miserable situation, like India, like Russia, like all over the globe. This is a political issue. It has nothing to do with these refugees. They are a tool in the hands of bloody leaders. That's all.
I wonder, Professor, how you regard the work of recent historians, Israeli historians, who, using Zionist archives, have actually shown there is evidence, contrary to the Israeli government's official position, that there is some responsibility, that there is indeed a responsibility for the fate of the Palestinian refugees from 1948, though.
You mentioned historians. You are talking about the new historians that now demonstrating in London, Ilan Pepe and his colleagues. No, don't start with me. I'm talking about serious historians. It was Rabin who mentioned the fact that during this unpleasant war, the war of independence, people were expelled. They left willingly. You are talking with a boy, 12 years old, not far from me, Rishon LeZion. I remember when they massacred about 11 of my friends at that time, and the people of Yabne immediately left the city, willingly, not because somebody forced them. And you mentioned, and I accept, it's around 700,000 refugees. And we ruined, and this is the encyclopedia that was done by Walid Khalidi, a Palestinian, about 400 villages were ruined. They didn't accept the United Nations resolution, the 29th of November 49. They declared a war against the Jewish people here. They invaded from Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Egypt. And my brother was killed at that time as part of the war. You blame me? I'm happy that we are the winner. That's all. Of course.
Dr. Johnny Mansour, I'm glad you could join us as well. And I wonder, how important is the recognition of the right of return, even if the execution, the implementation is a problem? How important is it to perhaps get some sort of admission that there is a right of return?
I think before answering this question, I think that Professor Soffer is still insist to declare that the Israel army or the Israel government is not responsible about what happened to the Palestinians during the 60 years. But I think that if he accepts to return back to the Israeli archives and even to read what your colleagues, the new historians, wrote concerning to the release files from the archives, then you will discover that 90 massacres happened during 48 war by the IDF. From the other side, the right of return is demanded from Israel, is not demanded from the Arab countries. The third argument is that in the partition resolution 181, there is no even one word say something about transfer, say something about killing people, say something about massacres in all these villages. And we have a lot of stories and narratives and witnesses from people that they be present
right
in all these massacres that happened in these villages, even in Galilee or in other places in Palestine.
On the issue of the right to return, but let me just ask you though, considering that according to all Palestinian history, there's not been a single Palestinian exercising any right of return. So to what degree is this a permanent exile?
Look, to deal with this issue, it is not easy, but to say all the time that the Israeli is not responsible about what happened in 48, who is responsible? We have so many stories and narratives about what happened in the villages and even in the main cities, in Haifa, in Jaffa, in Tiberia, in Safad, in other parts of Palestine. So there is a responsible about what happened in 48. For that, I insist that we need, after 60 years, to confess from the Israeli side what happened in 48.
Let me ask a question to Professor Soffer that came in by email. And this came in from Marie Labelle in Canada, who says actually, let's see, I do not think Palestinian refugees can return to their country. Maybe there will have to be some compensation, but no return. Now, to what degree can compensation at least allow some progress in what's going on?
First of all, I have here a piece of information. I made a research, and I realized that about 400,000 refugees or their descendants returned to Israel by wedding marriages and just, coming back immediately after the War of Independence, because we had at that time no wall, no fence, nothing. And altogether, exchange of families, 400,000 refugees came back home, which means it's about more than 60% of the total number of the nominal number there. The rest must be find a solution. Maybe Lebanon is much difficult because of the terrible situation there anyhow. Lebanon, I'm talking with Syria, I'm talking about Jordan. And in fact, it's much ado about nothing, because most of the refugees in West Bank, they are well established. The people in Jordan, and I visited many times there, I would say here and there some still pockets of problems that can be solved with $1 billion. It's much ado about nothing. It's propaganda only. And I don't start with to give you a list of massacres that they made us, and he will say, leave it. Well, look to the future.
Let's avoid a tit for tat. But let me ask you one thing, Professor, because you're actually considered the sort of father of the idea of a separation wall. That you were early on proposing this. So you can't see Israelis and Palestinians living together in any way then, apart from separated?
we leave now the refugee issue and we are coming to the roots of the conflict. I think it's the deepest conflict ever in the history of mankind. It's cross religion, society, nationality, economy. I will give you two examples. You know that between Mexico and America, the GNP gap is 1 to 4 vis-a-vis Mexico, USA. Poland, Germany before the unification was 1 to 3. Israel, the Palestinian, in a distance of about 4 or 5 meters, Hable and Matan, it's 1 to 25. This is the gap. Israel is a huge magnet. Everyone is willing to come in spite of what you just said. It's a paradise in the Middle East. We cannot afford it. You know that this year, Israel is the most dense country in the Western world. And please, I need some space for our right of return. This is the ideology of the Jewish people. And I am a Jewish and I'm a Zionist. Money, yes. No one will come back. Forget about it. Look to the future.
Let me ask Dr. Mansour a question that also came from Canada by email. Horst Klaus here touches on this issue. He says, formerly Palestinian-owned property should either be compensated for or returned to their original owners. Now, how pragmatic or realistic is it for Palestinians to think 60 years on there can be a proper right of return?
The issue is not the compensation. The issue is the right of return. This is a legal resolution of the UN. So it is a private, it is individual. So you can't ask the whole Palestinian people if you want all of you to return back or not. But it is a right to ask everyone if he want to return back, and it is a sacred right to return back to their houses, to their homeland. Imagine that a robber entered to your house and he threw you, and you can't return back because he changed the name of the street and he put his name on the door. So it is your right before compensation. After that, when you will have your right, then you will decide if you want compensation or not. And the issue of money, I think it is not included in the dignity of a human. And it is not right to speak all the time with money, with numbers, with statistics, because the issue is a human issue and not money. Because otherwise, you have enough money.
Dr. Mansour, how do you deal with the change in the geography of the country over 60 years? How do you deal with the fact certain areas don't exist anymore, that there isn't actually a place for some of the people to come back to?
Yeah, there is. There is plenty of places here.
Alternatives, you mean?
Yes, alternative for people to return back. Most of the kibbutz and the moshavs in Israel, most of them, they are empty. And they have plenty of lands around these moshavs, these kibbutz, and all these lands belong to the people of Palestine. That means this is a properties of the people of Palestine. So there is a possibility to solve this problem in focusing on the issue of the right of return. And there is plenty of places, even in the cities, I mean in Jaffa, Haifa, because these cities, the refugees from these cities, they are 25%. So if you want to solve this problem, there is a possibility to solve, but only to have a soul of that we want to solve the problem, and not to mention all the time, they are there and we are here.
Professor Soffer, an email that came in from S. Anoma in Australia says, for lasting peace, Palestinian refugees have to be resettled in Palestine. Why doesn't Israel, the UN and other peacemakers build settlements for Palestinian refugees in the West Bank? Now, when it comes to settlements on the Israeli side, or at least on the Israeli territories that have been taken, I read your letter to the head of settlements. You're not a big fan of settlers. You're pretty harsh in judging what they've done.
If the solution is to settle them in the West Bank, ahlan wa sahlan. I think this is maybe the solution. Although I know the difficulties of refugees in Lebanon that they were told in the last 60 years, you are going back to Haifa, and suddenly ask them go to Nablus. But you have to understand, I'm not going to start to quarrel, or I would say in this way, I'm not going to commit suicide. Take it for granted. And Johnny's proposal is to commit suicide. So he is completely irrational, not realistic, and therefore it's wasting of time. We will not let them to come here and to change the demography, which is so fragile anyhow. So ignore this idea. It's useless.
What about
solution?
The settlements, though?
West Bank, I would say much more. Yes, I recommended to Sharon about the fence, and I think that a good fence can bring wonderful neighborhoods. Please remember, we founded 6 industrial states between Israel and Gaza, Israel and West Bank. The Hamas burned all of them. But if you ask me, I'm ready to help them immediately, of course, because they don't want to do it. I am ready to do it, no problem. But don't talk about not the right of return, the demand of return. We will not accept them. Be serious, please. And please ask him to look to Pakistan and India and Bangladesh and Europe. This is the way. Don't go back all the time.
Well, Dr. Mansour, an email that came in from Adolfo Talpala in Stockholm in Sweden says, millions of people have been accepted in other lands and are citizens of those countries, but not the Palestinians. The status of Palestinian refugee speaks poorly about the hospitality of the countries hosting them. To what extent have they been let down by host countries?
I think that even to compare and give examples from other places in the world, it is good for writing, because there is a possibility, I repeat that, the Palestinians didn't want to compare Pakistan with India and other places in the world. We are talking about Palestine. The issue, how to solve the problem between Israel and the Palestinians, is to begin with right of return and not to begin with the apartheid wall. So the apartheid wall is a cage, is a prison for both people. Imagine that. You are living in an open prison and the Palestinians, they are sitting by the Israeli occupation in a closed prison. This is, I mean, this is two kinds of prisons.
Please limit the topic to one issue.
This is what I'm trying to do.
In half an hour, you ask me to discuss the history, the War of Independence, now the wall.
Well,
and
here's a question.
We are talking about refugees.
Right.
Limit yourself
we have
to
a
the
30
refugees.
second, Professor. We have 30 seconds then. In a line, do you think that this issue of peace between the Israelis and Palestinians can be resolved if the right of return isn't solved? Just literally in a line.
We discuss it and we change some ideas. The moment we will solve the most difficult one, Jerusalem, then the refugees issue within the West Bank, everything can be solved. The problem is much behind. The Palestinians are not ready to see a Jewish Zionist country in this region. This is the issue.
Well,
go to the roots.
Professor Arnon Soffer and Dr. Johnny Mansour, I'm so sorry we are out of time here. Wish we could discuss more, but thank you both for being with us.
You're welcome.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll be right back with the presenter of a moving documentary that follows the lives of a group of Palestinians who left their homes in Jaffa in 1948. It tracks them down as they live displaced in locations around the world. Stay with us for that.